series on the other in Jewish text and tradition. Special welcome to any first-time attendees. And we're really pleased to have a new faculty member teaching for us today, Dr. Jason Schulman, who is an adjunct instructor at JTS. And his session is called Looking Back at Jews and the Civil Rights Movement. A very timely session, and I think it fits into our series in terms of looking the modern, in the contemporary period at Jews and other groups, right here at home. We actually are having an evening of learning on this very topic, or in a related topic, Jews and racial justice, on May 2nd. It's an annual event that we have historically held in person in the greater Washington area, hosted by all of the synagogues there. It's online this year. So watch your email for that. It'll be an evening with several scholars and teachers from JTS teaching on the topic of Jews and racial justice. Excuse me. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have 2 sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Tzaddik for $1,000. And you can learn more by emailing learninglives@jtsa.edu. So just to go over the logistics for today. So Dr. Schulman will pause for questions periodically throughout the session, and we'll also have Q&A at the end. To submit a question, you can use the private chat feature, send it to me, Rabbi Julia Andelman, and when Dr. Schulman pauses for questions, I'll select from the questions that were sent in. If you have a question of a technical or logistical nature, you can initiate a private chat with Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received along with the Zoom link for today's session, and we'll put them in the chat as well. And on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Schulman, who, because of this pandemic, I haven't even had the opportunity to meet in person yet. So I'm really pleased, Dr. Schulman, to be meeting you myself today. Dr. Jason Schulman is an adjunct instructor at JTS from 2015 to 2017. He served as producer and host of the New Books in Jewish Studies podcast. His research interests include legal, political, and religious history. And he received his BA from Columbia and his PhD from Emory University. So with that, Dr. Schulman, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Thank you all so much for being here. Did y'all hear me okay? Great. If you celebrate, I hope you had a really nice Passover. It's very nice to be with you all over Zoom, but especially so after having a bagel. So it's really nice to be with you. This series, The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition, has featured some phenomenal speakers from JTS, so I'm delighted to be a part of it. Our topic today is looking back at Jews and the Civil Rights Movement. And if we can maybe start the slides, we can dive right in. Okay, great. So I'm not sure how many of you know this, but there actually is a rule that if you give a talk about Jews and the Civil Rights Movement, you have to start with the picture on the next slide of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King marching in March 1965. Okay, that's not really a rule, it's more of a custom. And it's a custom not without some merit. Of course, if you're going to talk about Jews and the Civil Rights Movement, you have to talk about Heschel and King. Is there any other image that so encapsulates the Black-Jewish alliance? If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then this is the picture of pictures. But one picture can only tell us so much of a story. And so while the ubiquity of this image has been helpful in serving as a sort of shorthand for Jewish support for the Black freedom struggle, it has had 2 unintended consequences that we really need to address. First, it flattens the relationship between Heschel and King. Beyond the fact that the 2 of them marched together, I would bet that most people don't really know the depth of the connection between the 2 men. Luckily for us, Rabbi Heschel's daughter has written a number of essays on the theological and personal affinities between the 2 men. But the second thing that the repeated use of this image has done is that it has crowded out other stories. To take just one example that's, I think, literally staring us in the face. Despite our familiarity with this photograph, a closer inspection of the image shows us something curious. If you go to the next slide, I've zoomed in on this curiosity of this image. You all have probably noticed this, but I don't know how many people have thought about it. The marchers' necks are adorned with leis, the garlands of flowers that are common to Hawaii. I've always wondered, why were Heschel and King wearing leis? It turns out that the flowers were a gift from a reverend named Abraham Akaka of Honolulu. They were a gift of support from Akaka and his Asian American congregants for the civil rights movement. Just a little tidbit, but I think that the importance is clear. The photograph of Heschel and King not only lives in the memory of many Jews today, but it continues for many to be the symbol of Black-Jewish cooperation in the post-war decades. And yet, the ubiquitous nature of this image of Heschel and King has crowded out, I believe, other stories, especially stories of those not in proximity to Martin Luther King. So, one question to think about: what other stories of Jews and non-Jews and their role in the civil rights movement remain untold? How can we be inspired by, but not intellectually trapped by, this photograph? Those types of questions raised by this photograph were the starting point for a course that I taught at JTS last year on Jews and the civil rights movement. I really wanted students not only to get the basics of the, quote unquote, traditional narrative of Jews and the civil rights movement, the one that's summed up in this picture, but also to explore new directions. Since I was brand new to JTS and the course was online, I really wasn't sure what to expect. But since many of you, I assume, are alumni and friends of JTS, let me tell you, as someone who's new to the institution, there are really inspiring young scholars here at JTS doing serious learning in really difficult conditions. So I hope you'll indulge me if I just take 1 minute to just share some of the work that they did. I challenged the students to come up with new directions to study Jews in the civil rights movement beyond the common story of Heschel and King. And here's some of the things that they did. 2 students used never before seen family documents to write about their own grandparents during the civil rights movement. Students looked at Jews in northern cities like Minneapolis, Rochester, and Chicago. Students looked at Black-Jewish relations in popular culture, including music and dance. Students looked at the writings of Reform rabbis as well as modern Orthodox rabbis. And students looked at the work of Jewish lawyers defending Black radicals, and so on and so on. When I was in graduate school, I was a teaching assistant for a professor, and the professor at the end of the semester told the class that he had learned so much from them. And at the time I thought, come on, you're just saying that to be nice. How could the teacher learn something from the students? But actually now I know that he was right. I learned so much from these JTS students, and it really made me think about the lesson from the Talmud, which says, I have learned much from my teachers, more from my colleagues, and the most from my students. So for the next hour or so, I will consider you all to be my students. And as much as I want to impart my teaching to you, I hope that I'll also get to learn from you as well. So while I'll be doing most of the speaking today, we will stop occasionally and have time for questions and comments. So please feel free to chat Rabbi Andelman, any thoughts, reflections, memories. I really would like to hear from you, not only questions, but also comments and thoughts. So we'll stop throughout the proceedings and have time for questions. So let's get started today. If we go to the next slide, we will see the plan for today. First, we'll look at a set of sources, some of which may be familiar to you, that will help us understand the traditional narrative of Jews in the civil rights movement and also to hopefully move beyond it. And in particular, I want to focus on the question of why Jews got involved in the civil rights movement. Then in the second part of the class, we'll look at another set of sources, most of which I assume will be new to you, but we'll see. And I'll provide a thesis that I think can help us better understand how Jews approached the civil rights movement. And finally, in the third part of the class, we'll think about what this contemporary moment in 2021 might demand. So after each of the 3 parts, we'll stop and take questions and comments. Just 2 final notes before we really dig in. First, just to say, I'll be speaking exclusively today about Jews of European descent. which made up the vast majority of American Jews in the post-war period. I hope there's some young scholar out here today watching who will one day investigate the history of Jews of color in the civil rights movement. But that's just not my topic today. So just to let you know about that. And second, we will be reading sources from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So there may be words that are outdated and we don't use anymore, but just to let you know, I've left those just to preserve the sources as they were. So, if I'm reading a source and a word comes up that we don't use, I'm just reading the source. So that's just the two things to begin. Okay, so let's start with part one, moving beyond the traditional narrative. Okay, I've already alluded to what I mean by the quote unquote traditional narrative of Jews in the civil rights movement. You can think of it, as the narrative that is symbolized by the picture of Heschel and King. It's the narrative which says, of course Jews were involved in the civil rights movement. Jews have a religious tradition that emphasizes righteousness and tikkun olam, the kind of ethical service in repairing the world. And Heschel is just the most famous and most pure manifestation of that impulse. But there were, many rabbis and lay people who marched and who donated, Jewish lawyers who battled Jim Crow in the courts. Famously, the text of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting, was actually largely written at the Religious Action Center, the political body of Reform Judaism. So that's sort of the traditional narrative. And while all of that is true, the reality is that tikkun olam was the motivation for only a small subset of Jews. Most Jews had complicated or even unarticulated reasons for their involvement in the civil rights movement. Yes, for some it was religious, but for many more it was historical, political, sociological, or just something to do. There was not just one reason. So in this section, we'll run through a series of sources, which I hope will allow us to see how complicated the question of Jews' motivation for participating in the civil rights movement was. It was hardly a simple case of Jews following the religious or ethical tradition. So let's look at the first source together, which I think encapsulates a more common feeling than sort of the traditional narrative about religiosity and ethics. So this first text comes to us from the reflections of Rabbi Jack Bloom. Bloom was the rabbi of Congregation Bethel in Fairfield, Connecticut. And just sort of as background, some of you, many of you maybe know this story because you're familiar with the history of the conservative movement in JTS. In 1963, in May 1963, 19 members of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the major association of conservative rabbis, went down to Birmingham, Alabama during the Birmingham campaign. And so Bloom was one of the rabbis that went down and later reflected on why he'd gone. So if we turn to the next slide, Bloom wrote, "Why did I go? I am not by nature a hero or a martyr, and it would have been easy not to go simply by not volunteering. I was frightened. I wasn't convinced that going was the best course of action. No impelling ethical urge or impassioned oratory moved me. I had no history of standing up for Negro rights. I had never before publicly committed myself that way. I don't like to stick my neck out, but something within me made it impossible for me not to go." So I think this first source is really interesting because Bloom is being quite honest. There was no impelling ethical reason that urged him to go. In fact, he says, it wasn't Judaism that made him go, but rather the experience that changed his Judaism. He goes on in the next slide. "During those days, the Negro became real. He became an individual. These men brought about a change in me. They radically and for all time altered my image of the Negro. Negroes were no longer an abstraction. They were no longer a sociological problem. They were real. The act of going to Birmingham changed me. To some extent, I empathized with the Negro. My religious commitment was really relevant, and the Negro was my brother." And finally, Bloom goes on in the next slide, which is quite apropos considering we've just finished Passover. He wrote, "In describing Moses' role in bringing the Jews out of Egypt, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy at a rally held in a church told of Moses' call to lead his people to freedom. Homiletically, he described Moses' encounter with a bush that could not be consumed, and he told how Moses avoided looking at the bush. God finally forced Moses to look at the bush, and Moses looked at it until the fire of that bush burned within him. Within that fire within, Moses took the first steps towards redeeming his people. I think that many of us felt that way about our Birmingham experience. Something about those days transformed our brothers' burning desire for freedom and equality into a flame burning within us. So once you open yourself up to the idea that Jews were not necessarily motivated by a religious impulse, but rather the experience motivated something within them, you start to see it everywhere in the reflections of civil rights participants. Even among those who say there was a humanitarian reason for being there, you realize that their reasons were actually quite complicated. Jewish women who volunteered to participate in the civil rights movement, in particular, often spoke about their experience of not having many other professional opportunities in the 1950s and 60s. And so this gave them something really important to do. So the next set of sources I want to look at comes from MIRIAM GLICKMAN. She was just a teenager when she got involved in civil rights work. As a recent college graduate, she spent time with civil rights workers in Albany, Georgia, including during a hunger strike. And so here's how she reflected on her involvement in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. She wrote, "I guess I need to be clear about my commitment. I had many horrible experiences. There wasn't anything else that I could have been doing at the time that had anywhere near the pull that this did, of helping make the world a better place. I mean, what were the alternatives? I could go back and get a 9-to-5 job somewhere. In those days, women were teachers, nurses, and psychologists/counselors, and Jewish women weren't nurses. So I had the other two to choose from. I would have stayed down there forever. I finally left because I was forced out, but all of us felt that what we were doing was the most important work that could be done. Nobody said this was a wonderful experience. If you find anybody that told you that, they've forgotten." So I think what's really interesting about Glickman's reflections is that she's quite honest about the lack of other opportunities and that the civil rights movement provided something that the professional world couldn't for young working women. Let's look at another source. The third source comes from Charles E. Silberman, who was a journalist for Fortune magazine. In 1965, he wrote in the pages of the journal Conservative Judaism, which was the journal of the Rabbinical Assembly, about the place of Jews in the civil rights movement. And his words are a direct challenge to the view that Jews were motivated by religious and ethical imperatives. So let's look at this slide together. To be sure, he says, a great many individual Jews are deeply involved in the fight for racial justice. All too often, however, it seems as though those Jews who are involved in the racial struggle have no commitment to Judaism, while those who have the commitment to Judaism are rarely involved in the fight for civil rights. There are notable exceptions, of course, some of them in the Rabbinical Assembly. So first of all, never a bad idea to praise the group that's publishing you. But I think what's more important is that he really sees a dichotomy between those Jews that are involved in civil rights and don't really have a religious connection, and those Jews that do have a religious connection and aren't involved in civil rights. He goes on to say in the next slide, but to pick a striking example, painfully few of the young Jewish men and women who went to Mississippi last summer had any understanding that what they were doing was in the least connected with their Jewishness or with the teaching of Judaism. Many would have thought you insane had you even suggested that notion. Equally important, the training they received before they went to Mississippi was provided by the National Council of Churches. No Jewish organization played any role in that training or in the summer project. And yet we mourn the loss of the new generation of Jewish youth and wonder why they drift away from any connection with Jewish life. Can we find no way by which young Jews can participate in the civil rights movement as Jews? Okay. Let's look at a couple more sources together. Next is Paul Lauter, who is an English professor and activist. In 1965, he reflected on how his family viewed his activism. And I think this is a particularly interesting source because it really kind of gets at the feelings that one has about family and some of the things that people choose to do with their lives. He wrote, quote, "My family, for example, has a bulletin which reports the activities of family members to all the others. It includes birth, marriage, travel, and nachas departments, pride about one's children. No one, however, thought it of sufficient importance or interest to report on my work in Mississippi last summer or to write of my jailing in Montgomery. Somehow all of that fell too far outside the periphery of their normal existence for them to see it as relevant or of general family interest." He goes on to say on the next slide, "Or perhaps they chose to remain silent about it for other reasons. They could see its importance once it was called to their attention, but they could not focus that attention by themselves. although they do not represent the Jews or synagogue Jews, their feelings, I have found, are shared by many loyal synagogue members and regular worshipers. You see a lot of this in reflections of civil rights movement, both men and women, that the parents just don't understand, right? The parents don't understand what these young people who are participating in the civil rights movement are doing. The last slide that I want to look at comes from Mark Rudd, who was a leader in the Columbia University chapter of Students for Democratic Society, SDS. Now, Rudd is not usually sort of in the pantheon of Jews in the civil rights movement, but I think what he expresses in his reflections about his time as an activist in the 1960s pertains to Jews in the civil rights movement as well. He wrote, perhaps our anger was derived in some unconscious way from the famed prophetic tradition Judaism, but I had never experienced any of it. Our rabbi congregation Bethel, Dr. Theodore Friedman, never to my knowledge preached about the legal discrimination against Negroes in the South, even as the civil rights movement raged on for more than a decade. Nor did I ever hear mention in shul of any relationship between those of us in the all-white suburbs to our Black neighbors in adjacent Newark, New Jersey, other than thankfulness that we had gotten the hell out of there. He goes on to say, this is not to say that there weren't decent rabbis and Jewish leaders who were active in civil rights. Years later, I became aware of Rabbi Joachim Prince of Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, both sidekicks of Martin Luther King. They are said to have been very influential, though I didn't know about them at the time. So we've looked at 5 sources of Jews who were involved to various degrees in civil rights activism and how they reflected on what they were doing. And while this is just a sampling, hopefully the point is clear, that Jews had a variety of reasons for volunteering as allies in the civil rights movement. The photo of Heschel and King has had a lot of power as a shorthand, but I think we should be okay with some ambiguity and a messy reality. There was nothing obvious or inevitable about why Jews got involved in the civil rights movement. Many did not, and many did for reasons that were complicated, unrelated to their Jewishness, or unconscious to their Jewishness. So now that we're sort of able to move beyond the confines of this sort of traditional narrative contained in this famous image, we can acknowledge that Jewish tradition alone can't explain Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. I want to move on to part 2 and try to understand what is unique about Jews' approach to civil rights. But before we do, we'll stop and take questions or comments. So Rabbi Andelman, if there's any questions or comments.
Thanks. I'm going to take the prerogative and raise something of my own first. So I'm thinking a lot about the session that a lot of us had with Rabbi Eliezer Diamond 2 weeks ago before Pesach, and we were looking at how Jews relate to non-Jews in through the prism of the Haggadah. And an interesting question arose. Is it sort of a more authentic read of the Haggadah to just continue to think of ourselves as being in opposition or separate from non-Jews because of our history of persecution? Or is the more authentic reaction to the Haggadah today to use our history of oppression to be more sensitized to other people's oppression? So I was thinking about that a lot throughout Pesach, and the sources that you just brought, they raised that question again, and I think that debate carries on through today, and I wonder if you could reflect, just since this is really your field and you live in this realm, how do you respond to that question of authenticity? Is there something almost pretend about saying my commitment to civil rights flows from my Judaism, or is it just kind of, we can read it either way?
Sure. I'm going to say let's hold off, because after part 2 we will answer that exact question. So rather than spoiling what's ahead, I'll say let's come back to that. But I think that is a really great question, and if I don't remember, please remind me to tie it back to Passover after part 2. So yeah, I'll be happy to answer that. I just want to get through some more of the sources. Okay.
There are a lot of questions of this, actually, this sort of overarching nature, but let me ask you a specific one that came in. So Someone was asking about, I think she was responding to the examples that you gave of your students and the cases that they were looking at. So she was talking about the cooperation between Black and Jewish students at Stanford in anti-war protests, which she was writing was often focused on protests about speakers for the Hoover Institution that came to the university. The protests were often challenged by the university and affected library workers, students, faculty. So in her telling, a lot of people have tried to bring attention to these cooperations and collaborations and sort of been shut down. I don't know if that's something that you can speak to.
Well, thank you for that comment. Definitely seems like something worth looking into. I'm not sure particularly about that, although we will look at a source from Berkeley in the 60s, and I think that in general there's probably a lot more research to be done about the history of civil rights in California. And just to plug something that I'm working on, I'm participating in a roundtable about the topic of Jewish civil rights in California, which should be coming out later this year. So, I think I don't know much about that particular topic, but thank you for sharing that. So Stanford, the Hoover Institution, there may be something for researching there. That's great.
All right, so now I have a flood of additional questions. If you can take a couple more.
Yeah, maybe we'll just take 2 or 3 together.
Okay, great. Okay, so one person wrote, so Silberman's observation was even more true from the great Jewish social movements of the early 20th century, which were largely the domain of non-religious Jews. There's an observation, if you want to respond to it. Interesting question here. Do you think any of this sympathy with civil rights had to do with Jews employing Black women from the South as domestics? I know, having grown up in the South, this person writes, most of my peers had full-time help at home, having come from the South after the war. Okay, and then one, gosh, there's so many now. Okay. And then, sorry, there's so many flooding in, it's hard to, then they're great questions, it's hard to choose.
No problem. Maybe okay, go ahead.
So I'll come back to some of them later, but maybe I'll just throw one more in now. So are there significant differences in the ambiguities and struggles which white Jews and white Christians faced in deciding whether to join the civil rights movement? So there's a hodgepodge of questions for you.
Okay. All right. Well, the comment about the person who grew up in the South, I think is really interesting. So thank you for sharing that. In terms of the sort of infrastructure, the third question, there were a lot of organizations, as Silberman says, which were set up and which were kind of grounded in the church or in different churches, and so. You could have sort of the leadership be, related to this church organization, but most of the participants, most of the lay people were Jews. And so, a number of the reflections from that period talk about how, they would be sort of hanging out and it would sort of go unspoken that, everybody who was sort of sitting around in the circle was Jewish. And I think Silberman's point is that there was no infrastructure. I mean, there were sort of the big Jewish defense organizations, but there wasn't kind of that infrastructure for, volunteering and getting people to do voter registration, those sorts of things. So I think that some of it relied on people, just getting involved on their own, and you can see a lot of this in their reflections. And on the first question about kind of the long history, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that's a really good point, that this question about kind of Jews and radicalism or activism is, I think, a really one that is really at the heart of a lot of this scholarship, which is trying to figure out what motivated Jews to do this. Is there something in the tradition? Is it something about being an outsider? Is it something about kind of the memories of their own persecution? like I said, I don't think there's any one reason, but I think you can absolutely ask the same question about, the old left and the new left, just to so to speak. Well, thank you for those, and please keep the questions and comments coming. And Rabbi Andelman will try to keep us on track. But thank you for those. So please share those reflections, comments, and memories. Okay, so in this section, let's move on to part 2. I'll offer a thesis about Jews and the civil rights movement that I think can help us understand the uniquely Jewish approach to civil rights. You don't have to buy the thesis, but I hope that at least you'll grapple with it. So to recap, we've looked at a number of sources that complicate the question of why Jews got involved in the civil rights movement. Now in this section, I want to turn to how they approach civil rights. What was unique about the way in which Jews approached the civil rights movement? We'll look at this thesis in more detail as we move through the sources, but for now, let me just state it this way. Unlike other minority groups, especially African Americans, Jews approach civil rights as part outsiders, part insiders. And because of their position in society, they imagined a different future and also interpreted a different past than other supporters in the civil rights movement. So we'll spell that out, but just to kind of give you a teaser. So first, let's look at how thinking about the future shaped American Jewish thinking about the civil rights movement. So to understand the thesis, the first source I want to look at comes from Herbert Wexler. Wexler was a law professor at Columbia in the 1950s. If you know the story of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was a law student, one of the few female law students at Columbia at the time. She attended this dinner where the dean asked, "Why are you all here?" Anyway, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was seated next to Wexler, who was one of her favorite professors. So it was April 7th, 1959, so almost 62 years to almost to the day, that Wexler gave a famous speech at Harvard Law School. And the speech was called "Toward Neutral Principles of Constitutional Law." And this speech sparked instant reaction because in that speech, Wexler, who was the grandchild of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, actually argued that Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 case outlawing segregation in schools, was wrong. Now, Wexler supported the outcome of the case, but he felt that the reasoning behind the decision was faulty. So by neutral principles, what Wexler meant was that when it comes to law, it shouldn't matter who the parties are, but that the law should be applied neutrally, irrespective or irrelevant to who the parties are. So let's look at this famous or infamous speech in which Wexler said that Brown was wrong and how it might help us understand how Jews approach the civil rights movement. So the speech, which I've given you, appeared later on in written form. And so I've given you an excerpt here. So here's what Wexler says. "The problem for me in Brown versus Board of Education, I hardly need to say, is not that the court departed from its earlier decisions holding or implying that the equality of public educational facilities demanded by the Constitution could be met by separate schools. I stand with the long tradition of the court that previous decisions must be subject to reexamination when a case against their reasoning is made. The problem inheres strictly in the reasoning of the opinion, an opinion which is often read with less fidelity by those who praise it than by those by whom it is condemned." Wexler went on. "For me," he writes, "assuming equal facilities, the question posed by state-enforced segregation is not one of discrimination at all. Its human and its constitutional dimensions lie entirely elsewhere, in the denial by the state of the freedom to associate, a denial that impinges in the same way on any groups or races that may be involved. I think, and I hope not without foundation, that the Southern white also pays heavily for segregation, not only in the sense of guilt that he must carry, but also in the benefits he is denied. In the days when I was joined with the NAACP attorney Charles Hamilton Houston in a litigation in the Supreme Court before the present building was constructed, he did not suffer more than I in knowing we had to go to Union Station to lunch together during the recess. Does not the problem of miscegenation, of racial intermarriage, show most clearly that it is the freedom of association that at bottom is involved?" Wexler goes on to say, "But if the freedom of association is denied by segregation, Integration forces an association upon those for whom it is unpleasant or repugnant. Is this not the heart of the issue involved? A conflict in human claims of high dimension, not unlike many others that involve the highest freedom. Given a situation where the state must practically choose between denying the association to those individuals who wish it or imposing it on those who would avoid it, is there a basis in neutral principles for holding that the Constitution demands that the claims for association should prevail? I should like to think that there is, but I confess I have not written the opinion. To me, to write it is for me the challenge of the school segregation cases. So for Wexler, it's not a question of discrimination against African Americans. That's at the heart of Brown versus Board, because that would depend on who the litigant was, right? It's a Black student, a Black child who feels discriminated against, and so they sue. But Wexler believed that the identity of the parties shouldn't matter. So he framed Brown as a case of freedom of association. There's those who want to associate, and there's those who don't want to associate. And Wexler asks, is there a basis grounded in neutral principles? So is there some kind of neutral principle that you can say that the side that wants to associate, right, the side that wants to integrate should prevail over the side that doesn't want to? Now, Wexler knew he was going to take some flack for this, so he concluded by stressing that he was not in support of massive resistance, right, of not listening to the Supreme Court. He concluded by saying, next slide, having said what I have said, I certainly should add that I offer no comfort to anyone who claims legitimacy in defiance of the courts. This is the ultimate negation of all neutral principles, to take the benefits accorded by the constitutional system, including the national market and common defense, while denying it allegiance when a special burden is imposed. That certainly is the antithesis of law. Okay, so what can we take from this text? I don't want anyone to mistake me for saying that Jews were against Brown. That's not the point here. That's not Wexler's point. But rather, I want to borrow this phrase from Wexler and argue that Jews had a sort of neutral principle commitment to civil rights. Jews were in support of segregation, of course, but they also wanted to get there in a way that was neutrally principled, that didn't depend on the identity of the person seeking redress or demanding civil rights protection. Why was this an attractive way for Jews to approach civil rights? Well, as we'll see, I'll argue that it allowed Jews to not only deal with the issue at hand, but also to think about other situations in the future. Okay, so let's look at another source where this freedom of association comes up. It's sort of an unlikely source, but I want to look at a piece by Hannah Arendt. Many of you probably know, the German-born political theorist. So in 1957, the country watched as a handful of Black students in Little Rock, Arkansas, tried to attend a white school. And they were harassed by white students. I'm sure most of you know the story of the Little Rock Nine. President Eisenhower has to call in the National Guard. You know the story. So Arendt wrote an article, which was actually commissioned for Commentary magazine, but was withdrawn and appeared 2 years later, 1959, just as Wexler was delivering this infamous speech in Dissent magazine. So her piece, Reflections on Little Rock, actually appeared in Dissent magazine. And famously or infamously, it began with a note written in italics that writers only add when they know they're about to say something controversial. So we'll start with that. She writes, I should like to remind the reader that I am writing as an outsider. I have never lived in the South and have even avoided occasional trips to Southern states because they would have brought me into a situation that I personally would find unbearable. Like most people of European origin, I have difficulty in understanding, let alone sharing, the common prejudices of Americans in this area. Since what I wrote may shock good people and be misused by bad ones, I should like to make it clear that as a Jew, I take my sympathy for the cause of the Negroes as for all oppressed or underprivileged peoples for granted and should appreciate it if the reader did likewise. Okay, so with that preface, like Wexler, Arendt says she's in support of desegregation, but she's not happy in this piece about how it unfolded, particularly these 9 Black students who have to walk through the jeering mobs of white students. So in the piece, Arendt distinguishes between 2 different realms, the political and the social. In the political realm, she writes, equality is the highest value. But in the social realm, the highest value is actually discrimination. Here's what she means by this. she writes, "It is common knowledge that vacation resorts in this country are frequently restricted according to ethnic origin. There are many people who object to this practice. Nevertheless, it is only an extension of the right to free association. If I as a Jew wish to spend my vacations only in the company of Jews, I cannot see how anyone can reasonably prevent my doing so. Just as I see no reason why other resorts should not cater to a clientele that wishes not to see Jews while on a holiday. There cannot be a right to go into any hotel or recreation area or place of amusement, because many of these are in the realm of the purely social, where the right to free association and therefore to discrimination has greater validity than the principle of equality." So note this same language here of freedom of association. Whereas Wexler saw the integration of schools as a fight between Blacks and whites over freedom of association, Arendt here explicitly asks, what does denying the freedom of association mean for Jews in the future, in the social realm? Okay, let's look at another source. Most of you probably know the story of the Nazis in Skokie. Aryeh Neyer was head of the ACLU in the late 1970s when the Nazis threatened to march in Skokie, which is a suburb of Chicago, with a large population of Holocaust survivors. Now, famously, the ACLU defended the Nazis, much to the chagrin of many in the community. But why did they do it? Why did they feel the need to defend the free speech of Nazis? So Neyer wrote, "Jews cannot hide from the Nazis in Skokie. For their own safety's sake, they must give the devil, the Nazis, benefit of law. It is dangerous to let the Nazis have their say, but it is more dangerous by far to destroy the laws that deny anyone the power to silence if Jews need to cry out to each other and to the world for succor." He went on to say, next slide, "Jews have been persecuted too many times in history for anyone to assert that their sufferings are at an end. When the time comes for Jews to speak, to publish, and to march in behalf of their own safety, Illinois and the United States must not be allowed to interfere. The Nazis," I respond to those who ask how I, a Jew, can defend freedom for the Nazis, "must be free to speak because Jews must be free to speak and because I must be free to speak." Okay, so here you see a real thinking about the future and when the situation might be reversed. Right? The next couple of slides we won't read together, but just to summarize them quickly, the historian Clive Webb has written something I think quite similar to this, that Jews were very wary about shutting down Nazi free speech because they worried about when it came time for them to speak, would the same laws be used against them. Let's go on to the next slide. Sorry, one back. Great, thank you. Okay, so a few months after Skokie was the famous affirmative action case of Alan Bakke. Many of you may know this case. He was a white applicant to the University of California, Davis Medical School who was rejected, and he challenged the school's admission policy, which set aside a certain number of slots for minority applicants. In the case, there was a brief submitted to the court by the Queens Jewish Community Council. And the council quoted the NYU legal philosopher Edmund Kahn, who had been critical of what the court said in Brown. So again, another Jewish critic of Brown versus Board. So here's what Kahn said that the Queens Jewish Community Council quoted in their brief. "It is one thing to use the current scientific findings, however ephemeral they may be, in order to ascertain whether the legislature has acted reasonably in adopting some scheme of social or economic regulation. Deference here is shown not so much to the finding as to the legislature. It would be quite another thing to have our fundamental rights rise, fall, or change along with the latest fashions of psychological literature. Today, at least, the leaders of the discipline are liberal and egalitarian in basic approach. Suppose a generation hence, some of their successors were to revert to the ethnic mysticism of the very recent past. What then would be the state of our constitutional rights?" So we see here, similar to Wexler, a real fear that the winds can change, that if the court rules based on psychological findings, and there's no principle now, a generation hence, things may come back and rebound. So if there's no principle now, there'll be no principle later. Let's go to the next slide. You see this most famously, I think, in the case of Bob Jones University versus United States. Some of you may know this case. Bob Jones was is a Christian school in South Carolina. It was a religious and educational institution. Its teachers were devout Christians, and it taught classes according to the Bible. And one of the things that it taught was that the Bible forbids interracial dating and marriage. So the IRS revoked Bob Jones's tax-exempt status because the government's public policy was to try to oppose racial discrimination. And the government felt that by not allowing interracial marriage or interracial dating, Bob Jones shouldn't be allowed to have tax-exempt status. So the Jewish community actually split on this case. The kind of big Jewish defense organizations sided with the IRS, trying to stop Bob Jones from this racial discrimination. But in fact, we actually saw the Orthodox community, which is not necessarily a community that was well known to participate in civil rights cases, actually supported Bob Jones. And here's what the National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs, or COLPA, wrote in their brief. So they wrote, however, notwithstanding its unequivocal position on matters of racial discrimination, the Orthodox Jewish community is concerned by the broad implications in the opinions below, which indicate that organizations created by minority groups in pursuit of the free exercise of their religions may be denied tax exemption and required to pay taxes, not for doing something illegal, but merely because they refuse to conform to the, quote, policies of the majority. The loss of tax-exempt status would undermine the economic viability of such organizations and hence their ability to exercise their First Amendment rights. They went on to write, for example, many religious bodies have time-honored practices and traditions which prescribe different roles for men and women during worship and related activities, including education. While these distinctions are not perceived by their adherents as discriminatory in purpose or effect, it is conceivable that the lower courts might attempt to interpret the decisions below in the present cases to require the IRS to deny tax-exempt status to any entity which fails to conform to the evolving federal policies on the treatment of women. This could include every Orthodox and many conservative Jewish synagogues and yeshivas, the Catholic Church, Muslim mosques, Far Eastern temples, and many Protestant churches. Now, of course, Bob Jones was a pretty unique set of circumstances, I'll admit that. But we do see the same idea that Jews are thinking about their own future in support of civil rights in many other sources. So I'll just take one. If we look at the words of Isaac TOUBIN, who was one of the leaders of the American Jewish Congress, and actually is a graduate of JTS. So TOUBIN was writing in response to Southern Jews who were not supportive enough, he felt, of civil rights because they feared there might be a backlash against Jews. So here's what he wrote. He said, courage is a habit. It is rarely an unpracticed, instinctive act. If we do not practice courage now, will we be better prepared if fear strikes us? If we do not make a stand when Negroes are the victims, to whom and with what plea will we turn if Jews become the victims? So to kind of recap this first section, in the post-war decades, Jews were supporters of civil rights. That's a given. I'm not disputing that. But I think that they approached civil rights in a unique way, which, borrowing from Wexler's language, I'm going to call the neutral principles approach to civil rights, which is you support civil rights at the moment, right, in the present, but you are also trying to imagine a future when the shoe might be on the other foot, right, or the pendulum might swing the other way. And you want to try to protect all people, regardless of who the party is, because you never know what the future may hold. Okay, so that's sort of looking to the future. So while Jews imagined these future scenarios, they also looked back in time through a unique lens, looking at the past. If we look at the Baki case again, the affirmative action case on the next slide, we see that all of the major civil rights organizations were against the affirmative action plan of the school. And the American Jewish Committee brief was sort of very honest in opposing what it saw as favoritism for applicants of color. So the AJC wrote, there are a number of reasons why racially discriminatory classifications in professional school admission practices are unsound. The most important of these is their manifest unfairness to individuals. Ineluctably, they penalize innocent persons who bear no personal responsibility for historic wrongdoing. Moreover, while assuredly most people of color in this country are culturally, quote, disadvantaged, not all are, nor are all whites by any stretch of the imagination properly to be considered, quote, advantaged. Rarely, if ever, for instance, have whites from poverty-stricken Appalachia been singled out as a group for preferential educational treatment. The AJC goes on to say, nor has favoritism been bestowed on members of other ethnic groups, which credibly can claim to have been subjected to generalized societal discrimination, Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, Slavs, as a result of which at least some such persons bear the economic and cultural scars of prejudice, and thus could be deemed entitled to preference as a form of restitution. So here you've got this major Jewish organization claiming that Jews and other kind of white ethnic groups, right, Greeks, Slavs, Poles, do bear some of these scars of prejudice. And we shouldn't focus solely on the communities of color, the main communities in this case, which was minority communities. The brief makes clear, I think, the AJC's view that Jews and other white ethnics had faced discrimination in the past, and they didn't get any preference, right? And so now to preference certain applicants would violate the rule of neutral principles, right? It shouldn't matter who the applicant or who the litigant is. You should assess people kind of as individuals. So although Jews were supporters of civil rights, I think what this first source shows us is that they looked back at Jewish experience in America and saw that there had been discrimination against Jews, and yet Jews had largely succeeded without preferential restitution for that discrimination. Let's look at another similar case, although much lesser known. So Herbert Gutman was a professor at CUNY who wrote books about slavery and labor history. And the source I want to look at today comes from 1977. Some of you may remember the New York City blackout of 1977. In the wake of that blackout, Gutman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And here's what he wrote. Quote, the blackout and the accompanying social disorders among many very poor Black and Hispanic New Yorkers soon will become part of contemporary urban folklore. Then he went on to quote a newspaper editorial. He said, consider the following newspaper editorial, and then he quoted the editorial. Quote, the class of people who are engaged in this matter have many elements of a dangerous class. They are very ignorant. They do not understand the duties or rights of Americans. They have no inbred or acquired respect for law and order as the basis of the life of the society into which they have come. Resistance to authority does not seem to them necessarily wrong, only risky. And if it ceases to be risky, the restraint it can have on their passions is very small. Practically, it disappears. The instant they take the law into their own hands, the instant they begin the destruction of property and assail peaceable citizens and the police, they should be handled in a way that they can understand and not forget. These rioters were plainly desperate. They meant to defy the police and were ready for severe treatment. They did not get treatment nearly severe enough, and they are therefore far more dangerous than they were before. Gutman went on to say, these words have a familiar ring. And then he revealed his trickery to his readers. He said, the editorial quoted above was not published last week in the wake of 1977 blackout riot. It actually appeared in the New York Times on May 24th, 1902. And the rioters described were not poor, disorderly Black and Hispanic New Yorkers. They were poor, disorderly immigrant Jewish women, mostly Orthodox and mostly living on the Lower East Side. So this is, I think, a really interesting op-ed where he pulls this bait and switch and actually shows us that the very same language of disorder and criminality that was used in the 1970s for the inner city urban underclass was used for Jewish immigrants 70 years earlier. The kind of comparison about the riot in 1977 and 1902 was meant to show readers that the same kind of language, anti-immigrant, law and order language was once used against our own people. But that comparison between, Black and Jewish immigrants or Black inner city citizens and Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side did not sit well with readers of the New York Times in the 1970s. So I've just given you 3 letters to the editor. The first one comes from a man named Harry Levin, who writes, Herbert Gutman is comparing apples with oranges. We have had many rioters, all using illegal shortcut methods of protest. The actors in the blackout disgrace of 1977 were stealers. He should know the difference between protesters and looters. They should not be compared. Or another reader, Morris Katz, wrote, I cannot deny that there was rioting in 1902, but it was for food, not cameras, radios, television sets, cars, and other commodities which somehow have become more necessary than food. If the, quote, blackout rioters are not to be held responsible, those who have made a creed of greed should. And then finally, someone named Irving Lester wrote, one must remember that the rioters in 1902 were not provided with any sort of welfare, rent support, or Medicaid. They were truly underprivileged, overworked, overexploited people who sought to make better lives for themselves in this alleged new land of milk and honey. In later years, when given the opportunity, these same former rioters helped build beautiful neighborhoods, fine schools, hospitals, and other much needed philanthropic institutions that contributed to the cultural and ethical growth of our country. I asked that Professor Gutman compare this performance with the principles and performance of today's rioters and their leadership. So to kind of recap, we have this episode in 1977 with the New York City blackout in which some Jews, while supporters of civil rights and would think of themselves as supporters of civil rights, interpreted the need for civil rights and the kind of conditions of minority life in this country through their own experiences, right? They thought about their own family's journey in this country. By the 1970s, Jews had largely made it in this country for the most part, and many of these readers wondered why couldn't other groups do the same? So to kind of move towards the end of part 2 here, Jews were much more than other groups, excluding, African Americans. So other than African Americans, Jews were sort of the most engaged group in civil rights. And while we can't come up with any one reason why that was so, the sources we looked at show, I think, how they thought about it. It was a sort of uniquely Jewish way of approaching civil rights, in which they thought not only about the present moment, but also about what the future might hold, and also about the experience of civil rights for one group through their own experiences as a minority group. And so, as Jews are looking at what's going on at the moment in terms of civil rights, they're looking ahead, they're thinking about the future, but they're also looking back at their own past. And so in the next and final part of the class, we'll ask what this means for us today. But first, we'll stop and maybe take some questions and comments, and hopefully, that this idea that Jews are filtering their own experience, they're filtering other groups' experiences through their own, hopefully helps us understand the question that Rabbi Andelman asked about Passover, which I think is, remember the commandment is to remember that you escaped from Egypt and treat the other, well, because you remember you were once a slave. Now, it's not because we actually remember, what it was like in our lifetimes, but it's filtering others' experiences through our own history, and then also doing this neutral principle thing, which is one time you'll be the slave and one time you'll be, sort of the master, right? Like you never know which side of the pendulum things will swing to. And so even when things change and you kind of become the more privileged position, you should remember that you were a slave, right? That you were in that more oppressed position. So I think that actually the message of Passover is very much a sort of a neutrally principled one, right? Which you should remember that the shoe can always be on the other foot. Okay, let's take some comments and questions.
Okay, there are so many. So I just want to thank everyone for all of the amazing comments and questions that you're sharing, which there's no way, you know, we can only scratch the surface, but I will definitely share them with Dr. Schulman. I'm sure he'll be really interested to read all the wonderful things that you all have written in. So just, you know, connecting to what you were just saying, Dr. Schulman, there were a lot of questions and comments related to the Holocaust and you know, how that experience impacted Jews and their relationship to the civil rights movement. So I'm just pulling a few together. So, so one person said, do you think perhaps those of us who were children of Holocaust survivors got involved in some way to overcome some of the issues of lack of control over what happened to our parents? Here was something we could do something about. And then someone invoked the First They Came for the Socialists and I Did Not Speak Out poem. Someone raised the question of affirmative action and thinking about it as a form of reparations, which Jews, of course, benefited from reparations vis-a-vis Germany and sort of Jewish opposition to affirmative action. He sees as being contradictory. And finally, I had a wonderful kind of testimonial from Peter Geffen, a JTS alum, and he wrote about being inspired by Heschel and King, but also very much by the shadow of the Holocaust. He wrote, I was motivated to go south. He wrote about a whole bunch of JTS students in Ramah and USY folks because of what I learned about the good Germans who stood aside as what became the Holocaust began. I felt a direct relationship to that historical fact. And he talks about how they went despite how it was really becoming dangerous for civil rights workers to go south. But I just wanted to include what he wrote at the end. He said that he did find many of his Jewish peers, both secular and religious, kind of share these sentiments. And he said that in contrast to the quotes of Lauter, who felt ignored, we were received as heroes in camps, synagogues, and they were asked to speak in Jewish audiences both then and up until today. So there's sort of several questions and comments about how the Holocaust fits into Jewish involvement in civil rights.
Sure. Thank you all so much for those comments and questions. We should see if we can you know, get all the notes together and form some kind of primary source for you know, what Jews were thinking about in 2021. That's great. Yeah, for sure. I think the Holocaust you know, was a very important factor for many Jews who got involved in the civil rights movement, whether they were, you know, themselves escaped from Europe, like Rabbi Prinz, who I mentioned, or whether they were the children of Holocaust survivors, or those that were, you know, American for 3 generations, but knew about it. And I think that there's no denying that, and clearly many reflections bear that out. You know, I think one thing to think about is, you know, why the memory of the Holocaust could lead one to get involved, particularly in this issue. I mean, one could make an argument that the Holocaust might lead you to become sort of more focused on solely Jewish issues, right? So I'm sort of hesitant to make a one-to-one correlation, but you know, I do think that there is something unique or interesting about kind of the Jewish approach, which is they kind of transpose the historical experience of the Holocaust onto protecting another group, right? It wasn't so much that the lesson of the Holocaust was never again to us, but you know, never again for anybody else. So I think that's definitely something that you know, is worth thinking about. And yeah, thank you for the quote about being welcome. That is another kind of realm of reflections. Some people do talk about how they were welcomed, you know, with sort of open arms. Some people talk about how they were welcomed with open arms because the people who were welcoming them didn't want to themselves go, but they wanted someone they knew to go, right? So they were very happy when someone came back and kind of reported on what was going on, you know, in the South, although they themselves had not wanted to go. So there's a whole range of kind of emotions and choices that people made. So yeah, maybe we'll take just a couple more and then we'll.
Great. So here's kind of an interesting, I guess you could classify it under critique. So this person wrote, I'm just going to read it verbatim. Can you speak to the reaction by Southern Jews at the time? I understand that there was resentment about Jews coming to the South and ignoring the local Jewish communities, which had deep and complex ties to the Black community. In Birmingham, that was exacerbated because the community had an open pulpit at the time, but no one was interested in applying for it. The feeling was that outsiders would come to town to protest, but wouldn't stay and become part of the community.
Sure. Yeah, there's a noted kind of disagreement or tension between Northern and Southern Jews, and I think it sort of makes sense. I mean, Southern Jews were much more kind of ingrained in the local culture, felt that their place in the community was much more precarious, and that when the AJC and the American Jewish Congress and the ADL and those groups came in and sort of dictated a national policy on local conditions, they sort of put their position in jeopardy. It might increase anti-Semitism. It might lead to all sorts of questions about Jews' place in Southern society. At the same time, though, there were many Southern Jews that were involved in civil rights. From rabbis to politicians to congregants. I mean, there's sort of no shortage of people that were involved. And I think sometimes the kind of dichotomy that says, Northern Jews came down and were really involved and Southern Jews were very hesitant, I think sort of overstates the problem, the issue a little bit. I do think that there has been more research in recent years that shows that actually there was a lot of kind of quiet behind the scenes work going on. But you can understand it. At the time, they felt they had more to lose, and yeah, particularly in Birmingham, there's a sort of a fight that breaks out between the rabbis that have come to visit and the local community, and they really want them to kind of leave as quickly as possible. So yeah, I would say that there's certainly that tension there, although it's we don't want to overstate it. There certainly were many Jews that did support civil rights in the South, and I had actually a couple of students, or one student that wrote about his grandfather who was very involved in civil rights in the South. And so I think, we with more recent scholarship, we are sort of starting to see that actually there was more going on than we previously acknowledged. Okay, let's turn now to part 3, which I'm calling Meeting the Contemporary Moment. So, how can understanding the history of Jews and civil rights help us think about the moment that we're in, particularly after the events of last summer, including the death of George Floyd? I think there's a more widespread sense that despite the advances made in the last half century, there's still a ways to go. So in part 2, I presented a thesis, a working thesis, about the nature of American Jewry's approach to civil rights, sort of how American Jews viewed civil rights. It's a thesis that I hope is effective for us to think through the kind of uniquely Jewish approach to civil rights, which is to say that Jews not only thought about the kind of present moment, but also thought about the future where things might be different, and also thought about their own pasts. It shouldn't surprise anyone that there's a growing feeling among American Jews today, and you can, please feel free to tell this to Rabbi Andelman in the chat who can share this, that the approach of the 20th century that I've kind of sketched is maybe not enough. We'll spell that out, but let's try to understand first why Jews were attracted to this, neutral principle approach. And then we can kind of see if in 2021, it's not enough. As we saw in the first part 1, we should be suspicious of explanations that are grounded in Jewish religion and ethics. I just think for most people, we can't ascribe their motivations to their religiosity or to some sort of ethic, will. But rather, it was the nature of Jewish experience in America that shaped the Jewish approach. More specifically, Jews occupied a sort of middle position in society, sort of outsiders, but also sort of insiders. And because they sort of straddle this line they are able to think about the future where things might be different. And they also interpret a past when things were different. And so we can see echoes of this thought that the Jewish position or Jewish activism is grounded in Jews being outsiders in many sources. We'll just look at maybe a couple of them. So first, let's go back to Lauter, who was the English scholar and an activist. He wrote, "So I end with two homes, something of a visitor in both, but comfortable and feeling fortunate for it. And in this, I feel very much in a central Jewish tradition. For Jews have often discovered value while facing the dangers of living in two worlds, from Canaan to America. Perhaps that part of me in the activist world helps evoke the Jewish part and additionally invest it with values too easily lost in the comfortable pews of suburban temples, though still found in a few important books and in the lives of a few rabbis and other Jews who I know." Or consider the next text from Mark Rudd, again, the SDS leader. He says, "I am so obviously Jewish that no matter how much carne adovada or fry bread I eat, I'm instantly recognizable as a Jew. I proudly acknowledge the drive for education in Jewish culture, which made me want to read about the world and to understand it and become a teacher. I also recognize that in my social activism, I have one of thousands working in the grand tradition of Jewish leftists, the Trotskys, the Emma Goldmans, the Goodmans and Schwerners of the 20th century. I honor this lineage. As Jews, our advantage in the past, though, was that we were outsiders critically looking in. Today, Jews sit at the right hand of the Goy in the White House, advising him whom to bomb next in order to advance the empire." This is from 2005. He goes on to say, "To be outsiders in a nation or an empire is not such a terrible thing. Keeping critical and alert has allowed the Jewish people to survive all sorts of imperial disasters over the millennia. The Greeks, the Romans, Islam in Spain, which went from Golden Age to Inquisition in a few centuries, the Crusades, Reformation Europe, the Russian Tsars, Nazism. This particular empire is neither the first nor the last to attempt to seduce us to join up, but we better not. It's our job to be critical outsiders, both for our own survival and for that of the planet." So someone actually mentioned this, so I'm glad that they did. As long as there's been Jewish activism, there's been disagreement among Jews about just how much outsiders they are, right? Is this, part of our tradition? Is this part of our kind of marginal position in society? Some Jews, particularly, I would say those on the left, think, that Jews actually haven't been as much outsiders as we might think. You hear this more often today, but the idea actually has been around for a while. Let's take a look at the next source from Michael Lerner, the progressive activist and editor of Tikkun. He wrote this back in 1969 out in Berkeley. "The Jewish community can rightfully point out that it did not originate the ghettos. In fact, the reason why so many Jews own land there is that they were forced to live there when they first arrived. But instead of realizing that the capitalist system has put them in the place of exploiters, just as they were once exploited, and then draw the conclusion that the Jewish community should be in the forefront of the fight against capitalist exploitation, they instead identify with the system, pointing out how they managed to make it within the system." He goes on to write, "The racism of this reply, with its implications that Blacks who cannot make it have only themselves to blame, is obvious to anyone who stops to consider for a second the differences in economic circumstances that faced immigrant families coming to the US when the economy was still expanding from those faced by those who entered a job market that has now a built-in unemployment factor." Or again, let's look at Charles Silberman from the journalist from Conservative Judaism. He wrote, this is back in 1965. "The truth, I fear, is that we Jews are resting too much on past laurels. We think of ourselves as being in the vanguard of the fight for civil rights, for racial equality and justice, and for a long time we were. We take justifiable pride in the fact that, as Heinrich Heine put it, since the Exodus, freedom has always spoken with a Hebrew accent. But that Hebrew accent, like so many other parts of Jewish life and tradition, is beginning to weaken and fade. The fight for racial justice has radically changed character and direction in the past several years, but we Jews, and by we Jews, I mean the leadership of the major Jewish religious and lay organizations, not just our benighted rank and file, have not changed with it." He went on to say, "The ideology and the approach to race relations developed by most Jewish organizations is inadequate and irrelevant. in some ways downright misleading in the present situation. He continued, next slide. While most Negroes are outside the mainstream of middle-class American life, we Jews are now on the inside. But because we have not yet fully adjusted to the fact that we are insiders rather than outsiders in American life, we are still terribly insecure about our own position. We want racial change, all right, but without trouble or turmoil and without upsetting the existing organizations and institutional arrangements. Now, it's, I think, remarkable to recognize that this was written in the 1960s. But I think it helps explain the kind of uniquely Jewish approach to civil rights and where Jewish and African-American groups have been at odds, when they have been. Jews have approached civil rights with this vision of the future where things might be different and the pendulum might swing the other way. And the past that was, part insider, part outsider, and maybe before they were more outsider and now they're more insider, but still, a little bit of both. While African Americans have approached civil rights through their own experience, which they've seen as themselves as kind of the most outsiders, right? So for Jews, they've been sort of part outsiders, but in American history, African Americans have been sort of the most outsider group. So what does this mean for us and for the future? I think it's fair to say that there are growing calls for the Jewish community, whatever that may be, the Jewish communities, to do more. Does this moment require a kind of doubling down of the Jewish approach to civil rights that I've sketched out here, of neutral principles? Or does it require, as many are claiming, a more focused program specifically addressing the history of African Americans in this country, in which you wouldn't say that we need to apply things neutrally, but rather there would be kind of a targeted particular program. Or to put it another way, do we say Black Lives Matter because tomorrow we'll want someone to say Jewish Lives Matter? I don't think it's my role to tell you what to think, but rather to kind of give you the context to understand the conversation, and you can decide for yourself. But what I can tell you is that honest dialogue requires an honest assessment of where one's coming from. And I think that the 20th century version of civil rights was this sort of neutral principle view. And so the question is, for the growing calls for things to change or to do more, will that be enough? I also think that listening is very important if you're going to have honest conversation. So let's look one more time at Silberman, which feels to me like it could be, an op-ed that you might read today. He wrote this again in 1965. Several years ago, a group of American Jews visiting Martin Buber in Jerusalem asked him to say something, give a Dvar Torah before they left. Professor Buber thought for a while and then said, "Why are we commanded Shema Yisrael? Why Shema here?" And then he answered his own question. Because this is the most important thing of all, to hear, to listen. We do not listen, so we are commanded to listen, to hear. If only we were to obey this commandment, if only we were to listen. He went on to say, Buber's homily is compellingly relevant to the subject at hand. The frequently strained and tortured relations between Negro and Jew. I am afraid that too often we Jews are so busy talking, congratulating ourselves, for example, on our leadership in the fight for civil rights, that we don't have time to listen to what Negro Americans are trying to say. If we are really listening, we would hear how we sound when we talk to Negroes and how differently we sound when we talk to whites. We hear Negroes as object of our benevolence or as instruments of our charitable purpose. We do not hear them as people. In Buber's terms, we do not establish an I-thou relationship with them. We do not hear how patronizing we sound, nor do we see how angry Negroes become when we assure them that we understand how they feel, for we too have experienced slavery and persecution. Silberman went on to say, I'm not proposing that we blindly follow any and every Negro protest group, whatever its goals and tactics. Such a course would be irresponsible on our part, but I am arguing that far too often our objection to the means, consciously or unconsciously, masks or rationalizes or comes down to an objection to the end. Now, to be fair, Silberman's view was more progressive than most Jews in 1965. But today, I think we do hear something like this more often. It's a challenge that more and more people are grappling with, and one that I think requires real engagement with the history of Jews and civil rights. So only by understanding, what was happening in the 20th century civil rights movement can we understand what the present moment might require. So let me close with a prayer recited by Rabbi Uri Miller in August 1963. This was at the March on Washington. This was, moments before Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Rabbi Miller was an Orthodox rabbi in Baltimore, and here's part of his prayer that day. Enable us to understand that our society, the American people, is of one piece, that when any part of this society suffers, we all suffer. He went on, may we understand that he who discriminates is as morally hurt as the one discriminated against is physically hurt, that he who is prejudiced may injure the object of his prejudice, but he also degrades the society of which he is a part. I think that's a beautiful prayer to close with, and we'll take final questions or comments. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. We had a question about Jews thinking of ourselves as white, and which is something that Ashkenazi Jews at a certain point had kind of the luxury of doing, and the person who raised this issue was raising how much racism there is within the Jewish community, and in Israel in particular, but here as well, against Jews of color and Jews of Sephardi and Mizrahi ancestry. But I think I don't know if you want to address either of those parts, kind of the racism within, or the kind of taking on the white privilege when we have the opportunity, Ashkenazi Jews.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for these great wide-ranging questions. I think obviously the question of whiteness is very complicated. I would recommend, if anyone is interested, I think last summer JTS had a really great panel between Rabbi Sandra Lawson and Professor Eric Goldstein, kind of about Jews and whiteness. So if you want to check that out, I would highly recommend that conversation. I mean, look, I think it's a little too simplistic to say that Jews just were white. I mean, I think the Silberman quote says it, right? Think about how we sound different when we speak to blacks versus when we speak to whites. I mean, I think Jews did not necessarily think of themselves as all white. I mean, maybe they were, partially white, or they were closer to white, but I think Jews have always been careful or hesitant to label themselves as sort of purely white. But the question is, what are sort of the benefits that have accrued even implicitly or just by default, even if one doesn't claim whiteness? There are, I think, certain benefits that I think scholars have traced. But I think the question of what Jews thought about themselves is also important. I mean, I think Jews have seen themselves as part insider, part outsider, and they've wanted at different times in history to articulate their sense of themselves in different ways. I mean, I think sometimes they wanted to stress the fact that they were a religion. Sometimes they wanted to stress the fact that they were an ethnic group. Sometimes, in 100 years ago, they wanted to stress the fact that they were a race. I mean, so at different times, Jews have wanted to articulate their groupness in particular ways that don't necessarily line up with the way America wants to, fit them into a box. In terms of the Mizrahi question, I'll plug a great little piece in Moment magazine called Jews of Color. What's in a name or what's in a phrase. It's a great little short piece about what does the phrase Jews of color mean. Oftentimes, primarily now we talk about Black Jews, but there's a whole host of Mizrahi and Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jews that are sometimes included in Jews of color, sometimes not. There's obviously Jews of Latino or Latina background. And so there's kind of different contexts in which that phrase is used. So I would recommend that piece as well. And then, yeah, I'll stop there and maybe take a couple more questions.
So someone raised just the truly defining difference between the historical experience of American Jews and Black people in America, in that we came, along with every other immigrant community, we came to escape persecution, or many other immigrant communities. Whereas Black Americans are living in the land of their persecution, they were taken from their ancestors were taken from their homes and brought here. So what is the land of freedom for us, and the home that we chose? The legacy is totally the opposite for Black Americans today. So there's potentially an unbridgeable gulf there. In terms of trying to apply our own experience or use our own experiences as kind of a motivation in civil rights involvement. If you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it in terms of sort of what America means, to each group. I think that comparisons are helpful to a point. But I think the questioner makes clear that there is a point in which the comparison is not possible because of the context in which both Jewish immigrants and African Americans came to this country. That is just a very different set of experiences. Gutman, who I mentioned, wrote that op-ed. His big thing was trying to compare the two groups. Not so much in terms of sort of why they came, but what happened once they got here, and not comparing the journey across the Atlantic, but rather Jews came to the north, northern cities around the time when many African Americans were moving north in the Great Migration. So he tried to kind of create that comparison in terms of the timing in the early 1900s of both moving to cities at about the same time. There are some interesting things that one can do with comparisons, but I think, yeah, the questioner is absolutely right. There are some limits to what one can do. And I think the quote that Silberman gave, which is think about how we sound when we talk about we were slaves too. I mean, I think goes back to what I said earlier, which is I don't think, I tend to think that most people are not, they're not trying to say, we remember what it was like to be slaves in Egypt thousands of years ago, right? That's not the basis of the comparison. The comparison is that, we have known what it is like to be oppressed, and, that is something that we carry with us. So, I think that there are some benefits to kind of these comparative, especially if they can lead to more empathy. I mean, I think that's good. But there definitely we definitely need to think about the limits of such comparisons, because it can stop us from seeing the real difference between our experiences. And I think the fact that, as we saw in the sources, a lot of the Jews that we looked at filtered civil rights through their own group's experiences. I think some people would say it has led to some blind spots. And so the question is, does the current moment demand something new?
We only have a minute, but I sort of want to squeeze in one more if you're up for it. Related to what you were just saying about the northern migration. So one person was talking about what we now call white flight, and Black Americans moving to certain communities, suburbs, where there were great schools because the Jews were there, and then the Jews moved out. This is very much the case in my family. My father grew up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is now just basically exclusively Black, and just we're living so much with the legacy of a lot that's happened since, certainly since slavery and since the civil rights movement as well. I know I live in Teaneck, New Jersey, And since the George Floyd protests, I became aware of a lot of tensions right here. There's a huge Orthodox community here. The Orthodox community has advocated for a lot of benefits to go to private schools, i.e. Jewish day schools, which some argue diverted support for public schools. There's so many local issues at play, in addition to kind of our activism on a national level. I don't know if you have anything to say about, in closing on sort of how to I don't know if there's something that we can draw from what you've presented, in terms of looking at what's happening in our own local communities and thinking about how to become involved as Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I think, each community has kind of unique conditions, but, maybe there are some common patterns. I mean, I think, if you can take one thing from our conversation today, I hope that you'll maybe have, sort of your antenna fine-tuned for listening when people frame things in this neutrally principled way, right? So if people are saying, well, let's do this new thing, right? And then the kind of response is, well, what about, what'll happen when Jews want to do this other thing, right? It's sort of when you're thinking about the ramifications of some policy on what the future might hold. And that I think seems to me very much a civil rights movement era type of thinking. And I think that, the kind of growing calls today are to say, like, let's step back and not ask what this means for the Jewish community, but rather to center other communities. Again, I don't want to tell people what to think, but I think that's sort of the conversation, right? It's not interpreting our own past onto other groups, but it's also not thinking through the ramifications of such policy onto us, but rather being able to, listen to a community that is crying out for help on its own. That I think would be a change. I think because I think a lot of what we've looked at today really shows that Jews have been central supporters of civil rights, but they also have thought about what that civil rights might mean for them in the future.
That's a beautiful way to end. So sort of knowing when to apply our history and when maybe to step away from it to hear other people on their own terms. Thank you so much. And there's so many comments about how enlightening and thought-provoking your presentation was. So really, thank you so much for teaching us today. We're so glad to have you here at JTS. I want to thank everyone for joining us and hope that we see you again next week. We're going to go back 2,000 years in history next week. Dr. Rachel Rosenthal is going to look at the rabbis of the Talmud learning from non-Jews at that time, sort of non-Jews as sources of wisdom in our own ancient texts. So a completely different approach to the issue. But thank you again, Dr. Schulman, for teaching us today.
Thanks, everyone.